Hello, hi, I'm Nicholas Thompson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Wired. Thank you ever so much for inviting me to join you today. It's a pleasure to get to talk about some of the big ideas in the world, even if I have to do it from my living room and not from the conference hall and the blackjack tables where I hope to be doing this. So let's get going. What I want to talk about today is the wired future. What I think the most important and pressing technological issues are for the world right now, particularly in the post-coronavirus era. And so the way I've structured this talk is I've come up with 7 big questions about tech after the coronavirus crisis. Because my fundamental belief about tech, and the reason why I enjoy being the editor of Wired magazine, is a belief that there's a set of decisions that one makes in technology about how one shapes software, what one does with hardware, the choices that we embed in the things we build that profoundly affect the way humans live. They change the way we're born, change the way we learn, change the way we work, change the way we're going to be remembered after we die. And they're really important choices and they're really important decisions. And we have to think through them and talk about them. There aren't obvious right answers, but the more conversations we can have, the more thought we can put in, the better outcomes we get. That's been my belief for years, but it could not be more the case than it is right now, where everything is upside down, where everything is being changed, where new businesses are going to come out of this coronavirus crisis, where old businesses are going to be destroyed, where we're going to have new ways of relating to each other and new ways of interacting. So it's my pleasure to be here and to get to talk through some of these things. And I want to start with a little note of optimism and a sense that right now things feel pretty terrible. Right now it doesn't feel like there's much upside or much that's new that's being built. But there will be. And I'm fundamentally an optimist. And I think we're going to come out of this okay. All right. So let's go through the 7 questions, some of which I'll be very optimistic, some of which I won't. But beginning with question 1. Will working from home upend Silicon Valley? And will it upend the tech industry? Because right now, we are all working from home. We've all set ourselves up kind of like this cartoon, which always makes me laugh. And what's interesting to me right now is that it's kind of working. You know, my job, Wired magazine, we're still putting out the magazine, we're still putting out the website. In a lot of information tech jobs, it's kind of easier to work from home than we thought. And I feel like there's a little bit of a work from home bubble right now. We all feel like, oh wow, a couple months in, well maybe we'll work from home forever. And the first thing I'm going to say about that is I'm a little bit worried. I'm a little bit worried that we're overestimating our ability because right now we're burning some of the social capital that we built up before we started working from home. When we go on a Zoom screen with our office mates, we know them all because we've spent time in the office with them. As offices turn over, as we move to new jobs, I think it's going to get pretty complicated. So right now may feel a little easier than it will down the road a little bit. I'm also worried about hacking. I'm worried that we don't have the infrastructure to keep people safe that we did before this pandemic hit. Now that every office is remote and distributed, there are all these vectors for attackers. And we've started to see a real uptick in cybercrime. People figuring out, oh wait, it used to be harder to go through the corporate paywall. Well, now we can go after individuals and see if we can worm our way into the network that way. It's another big risk factor, and it's something that cyber operations inside of every company need to really think through. There's another trend that I think will be accelerated from working from home that maybe people haven't grappled. And that is that one of the big things that has happened in tech over the last 5 years or the last 10 years has been the shifting of power from central organizations to individuals, right? From the core to the edge. I put up this slide of LeBron and Giannis because notice it's no longer the East versus the West. It's not the Eastern Conference and the Western Conference in the All-Star game. It's Team LeBron versus Team Giannis. In journalism, my business, sometimes people are excited about the publication. Sometimes they're excited about the individual. The creation of social media and all of those platforms has changed the way power works. And I wonder, as the office disappears, as some of the centralizing forces of having everybody in the same building and connecting and building workplace identity, as that shrinks, whether this trend will continue. And then I think the most interesting thing that might happen is whether Silicon Valley gets transformed and whether that will be good or bad for tech. Because one thing about Silicon Valley is that most tech jobs can be done from home. And this is why many of the tech companies were the first companies to tell their employees that they could work remotely. And Twitter has just said that everybody can work remotely indefinitely. So Silicon Valley has two things happening. First, it's the place where there's the highest percentage of jobs that people can do remotely. You're just typing at a screen. In fact, one of the things I'm looking forward to is in the work from home era, who is the first highly successful coder to get jobs at two companies without either company knowing they have two jobs while they work at home. But in any case, what's happening is that it's very easy to work remotely if you have a tech job. What has also happened is that Silicon Valley real estate is insane. $4,000 for a one-bedroom apartment. So in all parts of the country, people are realizing that they don't have to go to the office to work. In Silicon Valley, it's a combination of people realizing they don't have to be there and real estate being the worst in the world, or at least having the income to rent ratio being probably the worst in the world. So what does that mean? Well, if Silicon Valley starts to break apart and starts to spread, it would completely change the dynamics of the tech industry. In some ways that I think would be much better. I've always worried that there's too much power concentrated in one place, which means there's not as much political influence for the tech industry as there should be, right? Everybody's in one state, or a huge percentage are in one state, or maybe 5 states. You have 10 senators who are beholden in some way to the tech industry. It would be much better if there were 100 who had high-tech infrastructure in their states. It'd be much better if you didn't have to live in Silicon Valley, if you could set up tech companies all over the country. And so my hope, the best case scenario, would be that the coronavirus crisis leads to a breakup of Silicon Valley in a way that doesn't stop innovation and leads to the tech industry sprouting up in new ways all over the place. The worst case scenario, though, is that there is something magical about Silicon Valley. And the reason why it's kept being built up over the last decade, over the last 2 decades, over the last 5 decades, is because there is something special about having one place where so much activity happens. And then my fear would be, if people start to leave, maybe technology in the United States loses some of its competitive advantage with the world, which is something else I'm going to talk about later. So that's question 1. Now let's get to question 2. What businesses are going to boom? Because we know that with the coronavirus crisis, it's going to change all kinds of businesses, right? Back to sports. There's some things that you just can't do that just don't work on a Zoom screen. There are other businesses, again, like my business, media, where there are trends that were happening before that are just getting accelerated. We were dealing with a decline in advertising and the need to pivot to consumer revenue before this happened. That is only happening 10 times as fast now. There are whole sectors like the sharing economy where the whole premise of a lot of the companies is going to change, right? Every company is going to have to rethink how many touch points, how many moments of human interaction are there, and can they be minimized? What will happen to Airbnb? Will people be still willing to go into other people's homes? And if Airbnb really declines, what will that do to cities? Will it mean suddenly that artists move back into cities? Will it change the way cultural capital works? There's some fascinating implications of this. But the question for business, if you have a business, you have to just think through all the touch points. If you manufacture cars, you better make sure that every trunk is automatic. Minimize the number of human interactions, minimize the number of times that coronavirus can spread while people are using your product. But so that's an industry that's in decline and shifting. Let's talk about one that's booming, which is online education. This chart here is the number of people using Coursera. It's crazy, right? Clearly, we all have to use online education because our kids are at home. We're looking at lifelong learning. And this is a business that has always, the boom has always been around the corner for about the last decade, and now it's finally come. And so the important question is, when we're out of the coronavirus crisis, as I hope we will be in not too long, in a year, in 2 years to different degrees, I think a lot of this will last. This curve will not continue its steep direction. But come the fall, we'll have learned a whole lot about online education that will benefit us down the line. Another business I'm super interested in is telemedicine. Telemedicine is much more efficient than going to the doctor's office. It saves you time. You're not going to catch an infection if you're at home the way you might in the elevator up to your doctor's office. There are huge benefits. So why didn't we have telemedicine before now? Well, partly it was an insurance company problem. Insurance companies wouldn't reimburse doctors if they met. And also partly an infrastructure question. My mom, before coronavirus, had no idea how to use Zoom. Now she does. Now we're seeing the imperative of it. I think telemedicine is absolutely going to boom in fabulous ways. It'll be hugely beneficial to us, hugely beneficial to doctors. Obviously, you can't do all medicine. You can't get surgery through telemedicine. But a lot of the times you go to the hospital, you won't actually need to do that anymore. Another area where I'm thinking there's going to be a boom is in robotics, right? Think about all the things where robots can actually do what humans did before. This is one of those amazing Boston Dynamics robots. You've probably seen the viral YouTube videos, working inside of a hospital in Boston, where these robots have been sent to deliver medicine to patients to minimize the human-to-human interactions where the virus can spread. I think you're going to start seeing assembly lines where it's human, robot, human, robot, human, robot, human, where you start to see robots doing all kinds of things that humans used to do. There's a story about a slaughterhouse in Denmark. It's the one slaughterhouse in the world where there hasn't been coronavirus outbreaks at all. Why is that? Well, it's the one slaughterhouse in the world that is fully robots, cutting the pigs, getting the meat. There is a lot of work right now being done by people that will be done by robots. One of the things I'm most interested in that might change, and I think I'm one of the few people who believes this right now. Everybody believes that online education, for example, is going to boom. I think that self-driving cars are going to have a moment. You know, the last year or two have been bad for self-driving cars. Stories about crashes and questions about whether they can handle complex situations. What about inclines? And what about when the rules of the road change? Yes, absolutely. Those are legitimate problems. But self-driving cars are so much better than human-driven cars. They don't text. They don't drink and drive. They learn from each other. They can improve exponentially by acquiring information from every other car out on the road. Self-driving cars will make our roads much safer if we allow them. And there's a little bit of a backlash against self-driving cars. But wouldn't you rather get in a self-driving Uber now? Wouldn't you rather get in a self-driving Lyft? If you're getting a package delivered, wouldn't you rather it was a self-driving car that could just drop it at the curbside, eliminate some human touch? I wonder whether this is a business that's going to boom. Maybe I'm too optimistic because I love self-driving cars, but I think this might be a beneficiary. Because I think that a lot is going to change. That this is a moment in time that kind of maps onto this chart. That things are going to change at a pace we haven't quite understood before as we emerge from Corona and as we go into the next era. All right, question 3, and this is a huge one. How will we think about security and privacy? Because the way the internet started and the way we thought about technology for really the first 20 years of the internet is we kind of didn't care at all about privacy. You know, the web was built, the idea that information wants to be free. In order to have information be free, you need to have advertisements on the page, which you need to give up privacy to have efficient advertisements. So the whole economic model of the web was based on surveilling people and based on people not caring about privacy, and they didn't. There really was almost no pushback on privacy for a very long time, until about 2018. 2018, after the chaos of the election in 2016, a lot of resentment built up. Cambridge Analytica scandal hit. And at that moment, people started to really care about privacy and to worry about it, and to start feeling like surveillance capitalism was taking over the world. Well, what's happened since then? So I feel like internet, 2018, nobody cares about privacy. 2018 to March 2020, people do care about privacy. And then after March 2020, we stop. We reverse again, and we stop caring about privacy. And this is backed up in some of the data. And now we feel like, wait a second. If there's ever a trade-off between safety and privacy, we will choose safety. If there ever is a trade-off between an efficient product and a product that tracks us, and the efficiency will help keep us safe, we will again choose safety over privacy. And so you're seeing public choice after public choice where the values have flipped again. It wasn't like we didn't care about privacy, it's just that we valued things more. And then for a brief period, we valued privacy more than other stuff, and now we value it less. And now we're willing to give up a lot to keep ourselves safe, and for good reason, because we're scared. So what's going to happen? Well, we're going to have thermal cameras when we go back to work, measuring our temperature. They may have face recognition scanners built into them. We'll have digital contact tracing apps. Those may take off. They haven't yet, but they might. That will tell you whether your phone has been near somebody else's phone who's been diagnosed with coronavirus. That may be a way to keep people safe, to tell them when they need to go into quarantine. If you go further out, you can imagine our digital assistants, our Amazon Echoes, listening to our coughs, determining whether we're raspy. You're going to have thermometers that are connected to the cloud that may send you information about your temperature to your boss, may send it to your health insurance company, may send it to your work. We're going to have all kinds of surveillance that we've never had before in this country. In part because we're willing to trade off privacy and safety, in part because we've watched the authoritarian countries that do all this stuff have much more success containing coronavirus. We've seen the East Asian countries that are willing to do contact tracing, that are willing to put thermal cameras everywhere. They've been able to control it. The Western democratic countries have not. And so I think you're going to see a real shift. And so then what's the risk? Is that all okay? Certainly right now, I would set up a good digital contact tracing app. I would log my information, put all kinds of my information online to try to keep myself safe and keep others safe. But what about in the long run? Because there are real costs, right? So I'm a journalist. If I interview somebody off the record, I don't want anybody, whether it's the phone company or the government, knowing exactly where I was. I don't want them tracking my phone. There are all kinds of ways this stuff can be manipulated, right? You can imagine two coffee shops across the street from each other. One of them wants to put the other out of business. They can just leave a phone covered up in their rival shop, report it having coronavirus, and suddenly everybody who had gone into the other coffee shop would get an alert saying they had been near someone who had coronavirus. They'd have to go into quarantine, as would all the employees. You could put that coffee shop out of business. You can imagine manipulation of digital contact tracing apps being used to influence elections, suppress the vote. So there are real risks. There are real risks to our privacy. There are real risks to the way our society functions. And to me, one of the most important conversations we're going to have is going to come a few months from now. A few months from now, when we start to emerge and we start to feel a little bit better, and we're going to ask, okay, all that privacy we gave up in the name of safety, was it worth it? And can we go back? I think that's going to be one of the most important conversations in tech the next couple of years. Let's go to question 4. So what happens to the nature of work, right? This has been one of the big conversations in tech, certainly the last 3 years, the last 5 years. What jobs will last when we move to an era of artificial intelligence? What jobs will not? And I think the coronavirus changes the way we should think about it. I've always thought that as we enter the era of artificial intelligence, every business will be changed in some way, sometimes in ways that are unpredictable, as happened with the internet. I've got this slide up here, and it shows people who worked in the airline industry before the internet came along. What's interesting is that the guy in the tweed jacket, his job is gone, right? You don't need travel agents anymore. The internet can replicate that precisely. But the flight attendants, their job remained. In fact, the travel agent might have made more money when these photographs were taken, but his job was rendered obsolete. It's not like when technology comes, it gets rid of all the low-paying jobs or all the high-paying jobs. It gets rid of certain kind of jobs and transform other jobs. The smartest chart I've ever seen laying out what AI would do comes from Kai-Fu Lee, one of the great pioneers in artificial intelligence. And on the x-axis is whether a job requires creativity. Do you have to think outside the box, as they say? Computers are much better at rote, specific tasks, right? Telemarketing is very much on the left of the x-axis because it's a script. It's something where you just do A and then B. On the y-axis is something social. Does it require human interaction, right? CEO, criminal defense attorney, right? Somebody who goes to a conference, even somebody who goes to a virtual conference, probably high on the y-axis of a job that requires social connection, whatever it is. Those jobs are more likely to stay. So that's kind of the first path, and that's sort of before coronavirus. And you can think about it for jobs that require your hands as well, right? Robots have never been good at particularly using dexterity. It's very hard for a robot to pick up a small object. So again, if you have a job that is structured, moving a box like this or like that, that is a job that can be replicated by a robot. A job that requires fine motor skills is not. So you can put on the x-axis high dexterity, unstructured environment. You can put on the y-axis social. But what's interesting about these charts in the time of coronavirus is that the social elements change. Because if a job requires social connection that requires face-to-face interactions, well, maybe it isn't a job that's as protected as it was before. I think the nature of work is going to change a lot. I brought back to my industry a couple of times because it's one I know well. And I think about the kind of reporters who I'm going to want to hire in the future. They're going to have a different skill set. Up until now, I've wanted people who can go work a room, people who can go to a cocktail party and extract the best story, people who can sit on the bench at a court case, say hello to the person next to them and develop a source. Well, that's not going to be as important a skill. Learning how to do database analysis and learning how to search online is going to be more of a skill. So I think for every job, when we think about which ones will last and which ones won't, it will indeed require creativity and will indeed require social connections. But ideally, social connections that can be accomplished and carried out without face-to-face interactions. So that's a little bit about the future of work. Now let's move to question 5. Will there be a second techlash? By techlash, I mean the kind of tough reaction against the tech industry that probably everybody here has felt in one way or another. The tech industry was beloved, and then starting in roughly 2016, but peaking in 2018, there was a lot of anger, a lot of resentment at the tech industry. And then with coronavirus, that kind of went away. And went away for a couple reasons. It went away because the tech industry was very early in identifying the threat of coronavirus. First companies that send their employees home were tech companies. Tech companies understood viral growth, right? They understood exponential growth. They saw what was happening. They had a lot of information about China. Secondly, the executives at the tech companies behaved really well. They gave away PPE. They set policies to try to counter the spread of misinformation in a way they really hadn't done before. And then also, really importantly, a lot of the resentment that was built up against the tech companies disappeared once we were stuck with them. It's harder to hate Facebook when you rely on Facebook to keep in touch with people. So the tech backlash, in my view, dissipated quite a bit. The amount of resentment towards the tech industry kind of went away in the last few months. But what I'm curious about is whether it comes back. And the reason it might come back is because the tech companies are doing extremely well, while everybody else is doing poorly. A statistic that I saw the other day that struck me was that NVIDIA is now worth more than Disney. Of course, Disney, with its cruise lines and its parks, is in a lot of trouble. NVIDIA, making software for the cloud, is doing great. And so you can imagine a scenario where we come out of the coronavirus crisis, and the tech companies have all become fabulously more successful and extremely wealthy. Everybody else has not. And also, if there's one thing we know about tech, it's that they're doing well. There's a certain amount of arrogance, or cut corners, sloppy decisions. So I wonder, and I worry, that there might be a second techlash 6 months down the line as society starts to change. But there's a thing I worry about even more, and that's what happens to the United States and China. And I think this has been the biggest story and maybe the most disheartening story in technology over the last 3 or 4 years. Because I fundamentally believe the world is a better place when countries cooperate, when they work together. And I fundamentally believe the world is a safer place when economies are integrated. And the United States and China were never that integrated on technology, right? It's extremely hard for Google and Facebook to do business there. Apple was able to sell phones there, but to a small degree. You don't use Alibaba a lot in the United States. They weren't perfectly integrated, but at least they were starting to integrate. But then about a couple years ago, the process of splitting apart started to happen, and now it's happening with coronavirus crisis. Well, it started in China. The United States, for all kinds of political reasons, wants to blame China more, and legitimately, the virus did start there and was not contained there, and it is not impossible that it escaped from a laboratory in China. So we're going to blame China. We have an election coming up. There's going to be a lot of anger at China. China is going to respond. They're going to blame the United States. This is a tweet from a high official in the CCP. It's false, but here we are. United States blaming China, China blaming the United States. And what I worry about is not some conflagration over the next 6 months as we go through whatever political mayhem we go through. What I worry about is the technology of the world fundamentally splitting apart. And I worry about there being a Chinese tech stack, Chinese 5G, Chinese software only works on top of the Chinese tech stack. An American tech stack, Western tech stack. 5G is built by Ericsson, for example, and Western software works on top of it. And you get something like a Cold War. The countries in the middle have to choose. They have to choose whether they're with the United States or whether they're with China. And then the world starts to split and starts to fray. And there's a theory in political science called the Thucydides trap, which is that when the richest country in the world is surpassed by the second richest country in the world, there's usually a war, right? It's a very difficult situation to handle, and this is inevitably going to happen. China's GDP is going to surpass the United States. So how do we prevent there being a clash? Well, there are lots of ways, good diplomacy, lots of ways to prevent there being a clash, lots of smart things we can do on the political front. But one of the ways you can prevent a clash is to make the two economies dependent on each other, to make them integrated. Technology is the most important thing, most important part of every economy in the world. If they're integrated, you're much more likely to have a positive outcome than if they've split apart. And with coronavirus, you're going to see a trend of splitting and a fissure just get worse and worse. So that's something I worry about a lot. So now let me go to question 7. And it's one where actually I'm fairly optimistic. And that is, AI didn't stop this pandemic, but can it stop the next one? Right? There are a lot of ways that artificial intelligence can be useful at the time of a pandemic. It can identify early that a virus is spreading. It can help identify vaccine candidates, potential treatments. It can be useful in tests. It can help speed up vaccine trials. It can help us model populations to determine who should get a vaccine first, which is a fascinating mathematical and ethical question that I hope we'll get to deal with soon. But AI hasn't really done that much during this pandemic. Kai-Fu Lee, who I mentioned earlier, says he would give it a B- at best. It has played some role with AI systems that may have had the first warning signs that something strange was happening in Wuhan. This is a photograph of a man getting one of the first injections of the experimental vaccine built by Moderna. They found their protein candidate that they used in the vaccine, partly through machine learning, but mainly through human science. So there have been some places where AI has played a role, but it's true. It didn't stop the pandemic. It hasn't gotten us a vaccine nearly as quickly as anybody wants. It hasn't really solved this problem. So will it be useful in the next pandemic? And my feeling is that yes, it will. One of the great things about exponential growth, one of the great things about Moore's law, is that processes in computer technology and information technology go more quickly than you can possibly imagine once they begin. And my feeling about AI is that maybe we overestimated where we were in 2020, but we're underestimating where we're going to be in 2022 or 2023. And there are at least two places where I think AI will be extremely valuable. One is identifying vaccine candidates, figuring out how proteins fold, what they can do, how they interact in the body. We're going to have tons of data as we come out of the coronavirus crisis about the way the human body works, about the way we respond to viruses, about the way different treatments work. All of this, if shared properly, can be useful in helping to build systems that will get us the next vaccine more quickly. The second related thing, which I think is also extremely important, is the ability to model the human body. One reason a vaccine is going to take a long time is because you have to go through all these tests, animal tests, stage 1 tests to make sure that the vaccine doesn't cause side effects, small tests, big tests, stage 2, stage 3, and then finally you have to produce it. We're working with the coronavirus crisis to speed all of that up to speeds we've never seen before, but some of that can be done inside of machines. Some of the testing of how a vaccine would work, how a newly created protein could work inside of a body, that can be done digitally. And if it can be done digitally, you can save a lot of time. So my guess actually is that at the time a next pandemic hits, artificial intelligence will be extremely useful. And that is a very good thing, because I do not want us to live forever with the kind of fear we've been living with now, to have society transformed and turned upside down in the ways it has been. So those are the 7 questions. Those are my 7 questions for today. We're working from home, upend Silicon Valley. What are the businesses that are going to boom? How will we think about security and privacy? How will we think about the trade-offs between privacy and safety? What's going to happen to the nature of work? What about the jobs? Which jobs will survive with artificial intelligence coming? Will there be a second tech clash? What happens to the United States and China? And can AI stop the next pandemic? I think those are 7 really important questions. I've enjoyed having the opportunity to try to think about them, to talk about them. I hope that you've been inspired in certain ways. I hope that you'll go and have more conversations. I hope that you'll be in touch with me. Help me learn more about all these great topics. Because again, as I said, one of the most important things we can do now is to talk about how tech is changing the way we live, the way we work, the way our societies are structured. And we're in a moment of change right now, unlike any we've been in for generations. And there are going to be a set of choices to make that will profoundly affect the world we live in. Thank you so ever so much, and be in touch.